And so if milk were truly this nutritious food for adult animals, there would be some bird or some ferret or some opossum somewhere through the millennia that would have adapted, and they'd be sneaking up and they'd be sucking the teat of the cow in the barn, getting that excellent nutrition.
Welcome to the Fat Emperor podcast. I'm your host, Ivor Cummins. We're supported by the Irish Heart Disease Awareness Charity, which advocates a simple CT scan to reveal your CAC score. So, know your score and take action to prevent that premature heart attack. Everything you need to know will be right here. And we're on. And some of you out there may have been told maybe some little white lies by your doctor, maybe not intentionally. But today we're going to talk to a man of truth, a doctor who always says it as it is. Welcome, Dr. Ken Berry.
Hey, Ivor, good to see you again, brother.
Yeah, great stuff. We met at a few conferences now around the world so far.
We have.
Yeah, always good conversations. So that little reference at the start there was to your book, Lies My Doctor Told Me. So maybe we could start off with a few little white lies that slip out from time to time.
Sure. I just had someone email me today and say, I just read your book, Lies My Doctor Told Me, and I found quite a few typos. And I was wondering if you'd like for me to proofread it and send you a list. And I said, thank you, but no, they're actually Victory Belt Publishing has picked it up, and they're going to be issuing a typos corrected second edition with 5 extra chapters, full color, all the bells and whistles. And then it won't be just available on Amazon and Kindle full of typos. It'll be available in all bookstores around the world, hopefully with 0 typos. And so it's going to have 5 extra lies in the new version. And the reason that I know that most doctors are well-meaning and earnest is because I used to be one of these doctors that told the very lies that are in my book. That's where I got many of them from, is I repeated this stuff parrot-like because I was taught this in medical school and in residency training. And I had no idea that it was either based on no research or that there was actual credible research showing it to be completely false. And so for the first few years of my practice, I repeated many of these lies myself. And so I make it a habit, most every podcast and video that I do, I apologize to anyone I may have harmed by my ignorance early in my medical career. And so let's talk about a few of the lies. Probably the biggest lie in the book that doctors tell patients is that you need lots of servings of whole grains every day because of all the vitamins and minerals and nutrition and fiber that gives you. The human body basically can't function and will die if you don't eat, 6 to 11 servings of whole grain foods every single day. And so I devote a whole chapter to that lie in my book and why that's basically bunkum. And but that's probably one that surprises more people than any other chapter. Maybe the sun chapter, that's pretty surprising to some people. But I love the wheat chapter because it's taken as gospel in the U.S. and probably a lot of the U.K. that whole wheat is a gift from God when it comes to your nutrition. I mean, you're a fool if you don't eat whole grain every day.
Yeah, Ken, and you're absolutely right. That is one of the most prevalent myths out there. And I guess because we all have a nutrient insufficient diet, or most people in the Western world now, the fact that they fortify grain products with various vitamins and minerals kind of gives it some benefit, if you will. But the best description I heard for whole grains and grains in general was from Dr. William Davis, Wheat Belly. And he said, if I recall correctly, he said it's essentially a starvation food that humans over the millennia, if they were short on calories and they needed energy, it was there. It was a staple. But if humans had access to real foods like meat, fish, and eggs and, avocados and all myriad foods, then the wheat would not be required. Yeah.
That's exactly correct. And so if you're an emperor and you have thousands of peasants or thousands of soldiers that you need to feed as cheaply as possible, then wheat's very attractive to you as the emperor. Of course, the emperor is going to be eating fresh vegetables and fresh meat. But the soldiers, they'll do just fine. They'll have a nice short career in the military where they'll fight hard and die young, and they won't ever realize that they were basically on a starvation diet just to keep them from starving to death and to keep their bellies full. They were fed wheat, and that's kind of been the case in multiple empires through the ages. Rice, wheat, corn, oats were used to feed the masses because it's too expensive to feed them real food.
Yeah, and if you are someone like the traditional Chinese, you can get quite a bit of energy from the rice if that's just the way it is and you don't have highly nutrient dense foods. But if you add in enough meat and fish and other nutrient dense foods, it's a reasonable compromise. If you're working hard, you're out in the sun, healthy environment, you're getting quite a bit of energy from low nutrition grains, but you've also got high nutrient dense foods as well. It's a workable solution if that's what you have, but it's not a ideal or optimized solution.
Yeah, as long as your goal is not optimized health and a very long health span and lifespan, then grains, they serve the purpose very well. But if your goal is to have a body that's optimized and not inflamed and to have a very long health span, grains are probably not going to help you attain those goals.
No, there's a lot better food you can put in their place, to say the least. So that's a pretty big lie. And I think, recently there's been the Eat Lancet report has come out and basically pushing grains and vegetable oils. And we'll get to vegetable oils in a minute. In fact, to that point, are vegetable oils and seed oils the heart healthy kind of components, we're told? Is that one of the lies?
Well, I don't believe they are. And I think that's absolutely a lie that many doctors tell their patients, is that you should eat lots of mono and polyunsaturated fats. You should make the majority of your oils canola, soy, corn, sunflower, and doctors fully believe, and they go to bed at night with a contented, happy heart, knowing that they've done their patients a good deed by recommending these oils. And when you start to look at the inflammatory nature of these oils and at the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of these oils, you quickly realize that they are only a tiny bit better than hydrogenated shortening that is soon to be completely illegal in the United States. Of course, if you or I were doing something illegal, the federal government, if we were doing something illegal and dangerous, the federal government would tell us to stop that immediately or put us in prison. But if you're a big corporation with enough lobbyists, then they'll give you 3 to 5 years to phase out that dangerous illegal thing you're doing. And that's what we've done here in the U.S. is the federal government has basically given big food 3 years to phase out the very dangerous hydrogenated shortening out of all the baked goods and stuff. And so they've admitted it's dangerous, but big food has 3 years to get it out of the food supply.
Yeah, and actually, just from recollection, I think it was possibly the Netherlands or some of the Nordic countries in Europe were the first to ban trans fats. And these are basically industrially hydrogenated, basically solidified vegetable oils, which were discovered to be highly toxic. But you're right, in America, they kind of gave them quite a bit of time. And in fact, I think it was many years after the first country banned them before the FDA began to ban them, and then they gave a lead-in time. But they are the hydrogenated trans fats from vegetable oils, which everyone now accepts after 30 or 40 years of supplying them with a basically assuming they were fine. Everyone accepts they're bad. But the vegetable oils they come from are inherently inflammatory, and they are industrial lubricants, I call them, or
That's exactly
fuels.
right.
Yeah. So those in themselves, it makes no sense to have nutrient poor industrial refined oils as part of your diet in place of real nutritious ancestral foods. It's crazy, right?
Absolutely. Totally agree. And I mean, I just wonder if the bean counters in the federal government and big food just sat back and counted, if we phase this out over 3 years, I mean, how many people are going to die because of that? And they come up with a number and they said, yep, that's acceptable. We accept that. And so that way the federal government didn't have to come down too onerously on big food, and big food didn't have to lose too many billions of dollars. So everybody wins except for the little guy at home who doesn't know any better and is still using his Crisco.
Crisco, and that's 100 years now, I think, roughly, since Crisco decided to use these lamp oils as a foodstuff.
That's it. That's
So,
it.
so what other porky pies, as they call them in England, what other lies are floating around in your book?
Well, there's a chapter about dairy. And so we're taught in the US for sure, and probably other parts of the world, that drinking milk, it does a body good. You know, you want your milk mustache shining. And of course, if you're going to drink milk, you want to drink skim milk or 1% or half percent. And so when you start actually looking at the research and the history behind this, I posted on my Twitter the other day an old article where in a farmer's almanac that they used to use corn and skim milk to fatten hogs for market. That's literally the diet that they used to put fat on pigs as quickly as humanly possible, because back then they didn't have steroids. And so now it would be corn and skim milk and steroids. That's how you would fatten up the pig, and probably some antibiotics as well. But back then all they had was corn and skim milk, and that was the diet you fed your pigs in the feedlot to fatten them up for market. And so I was taught growing up, and even in medical school, that skim milk, that's great. You know, skim milk and cereal is a home run breakfast. That's going to give you all the nutrition you need to start your day, right? And so when you stop and think, why do mammals make milk for their babies? And it is literally so that their babies can gain weight and grow as quickly as possible. That's what milk's for. And so then you look at the fact that only human beings drink milk as an adult. No other animal on the planet does that unless we as humans force them to. And so that's your second clue, because you know, Ivor, nature always finds a way. And so if milk were truly this nutritious food for adult animals, there would be some bird or some ferret or some opossum somewhere through the millennia that would have adapted, and they'd be sneaking up and they'd be sucking the teat of the cow in the barn, getting that excellent nutrition. And I think it's very telling that there's no such ferret, there's no such animal in the world that ever drinks the milk of another species as an adult. They just don't do that. And so that makes me think that probably it's not a great source of nutrition for a grown mammal. And I started telling people in my practice years ago, if you want to gain weight as quickly as possible, drink lots of milk, because that's what milk is made for. And then probably drinking the milk of another species is going to cause inflammation and cause you to gain even more weight, both in fat and in retained fluid. And so I go into a little bit of detail about drinking milk and how it's just ridiculous. And this comes from a reformed milk baby. When I was playing football, which here in America is American football, not soccer, I would drink a gallon of milk a day during the spring training when we were really working out hard and lifting hard. And because I thought that was the way to perfect health and big muscles and strong bones. And now looking back, I can see how foolish that was, but no one around me knew any better. And my doctor okayed that. And so that's what I did, but it obviously didn't help me at all.
Wow, a sweet gallon.
Yeah, every day. But it was 2% because my grandmother wouldn't buy me whole milk, because that's bad for you.
Yeah, that was a great tragedy. And I do remember that some of those papers with fattening pigs with skim milk and grains. That was the recipe. And pigs are one of the closest animals to humans for experiments. In fact, in laboratory experiments, they would love to use pigs because they're so close to us, but they're a bit too expensive. And yet, how do you fatten them? Skim milk and grains. And also the vegetable oils, just to tie that in, I was chatting to Tucker Goodrich the other day, mostly about vegetable oils and seed oils. And he was saying a similar story that decades ago they knew that the bran oils, you couldn't feed too many omega-6 bran oils to the pigs because it could make them metabolically problematic. And they actually defatted the bran to get the excessive oils out of it and not feed the pigs too much. And yet now, the latest guidelines still say take the seed fats, the omega-6, and eat lots of them, up to 15% of energy in your diet, an enormous amount. So a lot of lies out there for sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think with the Eat Lancet, and then I think Canada just came out with their new dietary guidelines. And both of these entities are completely in love with seed oils or vegetable oils. And everyone listening, I'm sure, knows that vegetable oil is a misnomer. There are no vegetables in vegetable oils. These are seed oils that are extracted in a factory process using chemicals, high heat, high pressure, detergents, antioxidants, all kinds of different processes. You can go on YouTube and watch a video about how canola oil is made out of the rapeseed. And it's a pretty gross process, actually. But in the end, what comes out after it's been deodorized and chemically treated multiple times is an oil that's, I mean, if you just taste it, you're like, well, I guess that's healthy. I don't know. They said it was, the Canadian Dietary Guidelines and Eat Lancet say that I should eat lots of seed oil. So I guess they're good for me. And that's one of the many ways that humans have been misleading their own selves over the last 50 or 60 years.
Yeah, for sure. And we probably won't go down too deep in the vegetable oils, though I did talk about it for a couple of hours the other day in the last podcast with Tucker. And it's a fascinating subject. And the sheer volume of mechanistic studies in animals and a load more science showing how this is a crazy idea is largely ignored. It's largely ignored because they are an economic staple. And the belief that polyunsaturated oils will be better than other fats is so entrenched. But yeah, another topic I was going to bring up, besides the lies, of which there are many, is blood tests. So a lot of people around the world who have an interest in their own health are kind of fixated on blood tests and what do the blood tests mean? What blood tests do I need? The doctors, the medical system revolves around blood tests and medicating based on them. So maybe get your idea on some of the best blood tests, and then we maybe finish up that topic with ones that might not be so useful as people think.
Sure. So I've been practicing medicine in Tennessee in the U.S. for going on 20 years now. And I've always been kind of a maverick, checking out this new lab test, that new lab test. I wonder what this will help me with. And I can remember when the NMR lipo profile came out, I wore that thing out for a few years thinking that I was really gleaning a lot more information than with just the old standard lipid panel. I now kind of have a mixed opinion about that. But if you want to really get to the bottom of your metabolic health, there's really just a very few tests really that you need to check and monitor. And most of these tests are not checked by the standard U.S. physician or advanced practice practitioner at all. And so I'll give you an example, Ivor, of what can happen. And so someone my age, I just turned 50, as you may know. And so I go to the doctor for my annual checkup, right? And he's like, okay, we're going to check some bloods or some lab work. We're going to check a complete blood count. We're going to check a basic metabolic panel. We're going to check a lipid panel, of course, got to have that. We're going to check a urinalysis. And I'm 50 now, so I would get a PSA in the U.S., and they would want to talk to me about a colonoscopy if I wanted to do that, or if I wanted to do a fecal occult blood test as a screening test for colon cancer. And so let's talk about each of those. So a complete blood count, that's going to see if I have leukemia, if I have anemia, if I have some weird blood dyscrasia. So it's a useful test, but really for just an average screening, it doesn't really give you much information unless you detect an anemia. Then you can investigate that further. And so next is the basic metabolic panel, which checks your kidneys in some detail and your electrolytes, and it checks a blood sugar. Now these tests would be done fasting. And so if my blood sugar was 98 on this fasting test, the doc would say, okay, great, everything looks great, I'll see you next year. Now, I know you know this, Ivor, but a lot of people don't realize you can have severe type 2 diabetes and have a normal fasting blood sugar or fasting glucose. And so he's blind without checking hemoglobin A1C. He has no idea whether I have type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes. He doesn't know. Now, if I've got type 1, I'm probably not going to have a normal fasting blood sugar. But if I'm like the majority of Americans, because out of all the diabetics in the U.S., about 90% are type 2. If I haven't eaten all night and for a few hours this morning, I'll have a pretty normal blood sugar, right? But I could have severe type 2 diabetes, and he's blind to that. And so if I have any kidney damage, the basic metabolic panel will pick that up. But what if I have fatty liver? What if I have severe fatty liver? The basic metabolic panel doesn't check your liver in any way. And so he, again, will be completely blind to a very obvious marker of metabolic disease just by checking kind of the standard bloods that we check here in the US. And so if my blood sugar, if I'm a severe type 2 diabetic, but my blood sugar is less than 180, then I won't spill any any glucose into my urine, because that's about the cutoff, about 180 or 190 here in the US. And so again, he sees the urine, it all looks good. Okay, looks good. I'll see you next year. And he just missed my type 2 diabetes in the urine as well. He checks the lipid panel and he sees a high total cholesterol and he flips out about that. And he completely ignores the triglycerides and the HDL, which could actually give some meaningful information about my metabolic health, right? And then he'll check the other stuff just that's age appropriate for me. But you can see just very quickly, a doctor just checking these standard annual labs could miss multiple very severe markers of metabolic disease and think he's done a good job, send you home for another year to be complacent and happy in your disease, and then he rests well that night considering that he's done a well done job. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. And the metabolic diseases that are being missed are the most prevalent diseases that cause the most problems in the world. So it's not just missing, rare diseases or relatively rare. They're missing the elephant in the room.
That's
And
exactly right. And so basically, the diabetes epidemic and the fatty liver epidemic have snuck up on us in the U.S. because we're not even checking for it. And so, of course, if you don't check for it, you're not going to find it. And so only in the very latest stages, when there starts to be bilirubin in the urine, and they're like, oh, that's concerning, we better check a liver panel, then they discover the fatty liver after it's gone on for so many years or so many decades that you now have cirrhosis of the liver. You have non-alcoholic steatohepatitis at this point, and you've already done permanent damage to your liver. Or they'll catch the kidney damage when your creatinine level elevates, and you've got stage 1 or stage 2 chronic kidney disease. Could have been caught 10 years earlier if they'd been looking appropriately. And then after, when they see the fatty liver finally, then they check an A1C and say, oh my God, your A1C is 10. You have severe type 2 diabetes. We better get you on 3 pills and an injection for that. And by this time, your body's already so damaged, you're circling the graveyard at that point.
yeah, and of course your arteries, the biggest killer in the world, cardiovascular disease, your arteries have taken an absolutely punishing decade or two, and you never even knew you had a problem. While
You thought you were healthy. For the last 15 years, your doctor has said, good job, Mr. Berry, you're doing a great job. I'll see you next year. And another egregious thing that happens, Ivor, is that many times the fasting blood glucose will be a few points high. It'll be 102, 105. And the doc will say, well, your blood sugar's a little high. Cut back on saturated fat, eat more whole grains, and then we'll check it again next year.
and
Malpractice, right? That's you can't even call that anything except malpractice, but it happens every single day in the U.S. because many doctors here evidently don't know the power of a hemoglobin A1C or a C-peptide or a fasting insulin to actually look for these metabolic diseases that are killing us all very quickly.
And interestingly, the HbA1c measure of kind of long-term blood glucose levels is much better, but even that can fail, particularly in athletic people. So I work on behalf of Irish Heart Disease Awareness, and we're getting out awareness around the world on heart disease and calcification scan to catch the people who are hugely diseased but missed by all the measures you're talking about. And actually the founder of that, David Bobbitt, actually had a normal A1C of 5.3, and he was hugely diabetic with multiple blocked arteries from that diabetes. Now, in fairness, the HbA1c is pretty good, way better than fasting glucose, but it's interesting that even that can miss a huge diabetic, especially if they're very active, whereas the insulin you mentioned, or post-meal glucose measurements, now they're pretty hot, right?
Yeah, and they give a lot more information. And I have a great success using the C-peptide level, which is basically a little molecule that when insulin's manufactured in the beta cells in the pancreas, it's made as pre-proinsulin, and it has C-peptide attached to two insulin molecules. And when they all break apart, the insulin, as you know, constantly fluctuates in the bloodstream depending on whether you've eaten or not, whereas the C-peptide stays pretty constant all day long. And so I don't have to try to get 100 people in my clinic at 8 a.m. so I can check fasting bloods on everybody. I can check a C-peptide and an A1C pretty much any time of the day. And you're right. Even both of those will miss a very few people who have metabolic disease. But the majority of my practice is just middle America, right? Kind of salt of the earth, everyday man. And I'm going to catch about 99% of hyperinsulinemia and early prediabetes with those two tests. And so that's what I typically use on a day-to-day in my practice.
Yeah, and you know what, Ken? That's an important point. I guess HbA1c may still be fallible, better than glucose, but if you add in C-peptide, which is a great version of measuring insulin loading, then you're streaking way ahead. I mean, it would be lovely if people could get a pro-insulin measurement, but that's more a laboratory measurement or experimental. But C-peptide is cheap and quick. And as you say, it has a longer half-life than insulin. It's more stable, and it's a great measure people should be using.
Yep. And I've had people who will e-visit with me on the e-visit app, or they'll talk to me on a Facebook Live and say, I went and asked my doctor for a C-peptide and a fasting insulin and an A1C, and he said that I didn't need that, and he literally refused to order the test. And the person will say, I even pulled out my checkbook and said, look, doc, I'll pay. I don't care. I don't want to bill insurance for it. And the doctor absolutely refused to check the key labs that would discover this person's metabolic disease. And so they would wind up going to some online laboratory and getting it done themselves and find out that they're pre-diabetic and very insulin resistant. And of course, at that point, the doctor gets fired for being an idiot, which he is, if he says things like that, and they find a new doctor, or they start following the William Davis model and just being their own doctor because the doctor just about killed them.
And you know what? That doctor in question is actually a really smart guy, but I think some of us become idiots because we live in a fishbowl where we've been educated and indoctrinated, and even really smart people who are technically good people can end up being effectively an idiot.
Absolutely. Anybody in a professional capacity, whether it's a doctor or an engineer or anybody like that, examples of people you work with, of someone who's just a veritable genius, but yet at the same time can just be completely ignorant at the same time. And then if you blend that ignorance with haughtiness or cockiness, that's a very dangerous mix. And the average doctor in the U.S. is kind of proud of himself that he's a doctor, and he also is very ignorant in many of the ways that you would diagnose and tease out metabolic disease. And that's a very dangerous combination. And what you wind up with when you have that combination is an epidemic of prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, and fatty liver and kidney failure, which we are currently experiencing in the United States.
You sure are, Ken. And the latest Centers of Disease Control figures, I often quote this one, I got sent a paper, and around 64% of over 45s by glucose measurements are now pre-diabetic or diabetic, which is diabetic. They're all diabetic.
And it is now normal in the United States. If you're over 40, it's now normal to be a diabetic. It's abnormal if you're not a diabetic in the United States if you're older than 40. Yeah.
So we have ended up in a situation now in the Western world, particularly the US, but everyone else is catching up, that the majority of your adult population share one pathological disease state. The majority. And most doctors would never agree with that statement until you showed them the data, and they kind of scratched their head and went, how did I not know this?
Right. Exactly right. And I can tell you, early in my medical career, I did not know this. And I was that very doctor that would check a BMP and a CBC and a lipid panel and a urine. And I would tell you, you're great. Mr. Cummins, I'll see you in a year. I was that guy for the first few years. And if it hadn't been for my iconoclastic side and my maverick side that said, I think there's more to it than this. This doesn't make any sense because some of my patients are morbidly obese and look miserable. Their skin looks terrible. And I would think there's got to be something else I need to be checking on these people. But at the time, I didn't know what to check. And so only just by continued reading, trial and error, looking, studying, researching, listening to podcasts, and yes, watching YouTube videos, I would say, oh, C-peptide. Let me read about that and see what that does. I'm going to check that on a few people and see if that helps me out any. And so now my standard annual lab work contains probably 5 times as many laboratory tests as the average doctor would do. And I've gotten some kickback from insurance companies and the state medical board because I order so much testing. But, my job is first to do no harm. And if I send you home with type 2 diabetes that's undiagnosed, I'm pretty sure that's doing harm.
Yeah, for sure. Well, type 2 diabetes is kind of a previous heart attack equivalent. The risk is so high for heart disease, the biggest killer. With type 2 diabetes, it's nearly equivalent to you've had a heart attack before, you're a high risk patient. And yet it's undiagnosed overwhelmingly. But that probably brings me on to the next thing I was going to ask. So you can measure the blood tests, and I sometimes joke, depending on the person who's interpreting them, they can be kind of like the tea leaves or the chicken guts. You're guessing at disease. But what about, and I have my own opinion on this, you're probably aware of, what about actually finding out the person in front of you, if there's ambiguous tests or their middle risk, which is a gray area, actually finding out how much heart disease or atherosclerosis they have?
I'm right there behind you, Ivor. I've been checking more and more coronary artery calcium scores, and I've actually had patients coming to me saying, "Hey, will you check my CAC?" And I'm like, "Hell yeah, I'll check your CAC." And so there are actually some imaging centers in the United States where you don't even need a doctor's order to get a CAC score. You can just go into the imaging center and they'll do it for $100 or $120. But yeah, any patient who asks definitely gets one from me. And if there's any muddiness in the water of their diagnosis, then they're going to get a CAC. I'm playing around with CIMTs to see how that correlates with CAC scoring, carotid Doppler. And I've been using a lot of these imaging modalities for years because a lot of people don't know this about me, but I was a radiologic technologist before I went to medical school. And so I was very intimately aware of imaging and what it can show you way before I was a doctor. And so I've always been very quick to pull the trigger for some kind of imaging study, unless there was going to be too much radiation involved, and that would, be more risk than benefit. But the CAC score gives very little in the way of radiation exposure, and the potential diagnostic information you glean from it is immense. And you can find out basically a plus or minus, do you have coronary artery disease or not? I can know that in 5 minutes with a CAC score, and I'm using those more and more in my practice.
Excellent. Yeah. So IHDA, who I work for, and myself personally are on a mission to get that knowledge out there to the ordinary people who really would take action if they knew and could see on a scan they have massive disease. But we'll continue battling. But that's great to hear. So for someone who has disease then, there's diet and lifestyle, and Eat Lancet has come out with probably the opposite advice we might give. But in summary, what are the primary dietary and lifestyle things you do if you got a high CAC score and you realize, wow, I've got big disease, I need to stop it progressing. I need to take some steps now and stop the progression of this disease, because it can be done. What are the primary list of things you do?
So with the paradigm that this disease is being caused by chronically high blood glucose levels, chronically high serum insulin levels, and chronically high levels of inflammation, that's my current paradigm of what's leading to all this heart attack and stroke in the US and in the world. So I'm gonna do everything I can to return those levels back to as low normal as I possibly can. And so for my patients, the first 3 steps are to stop all sugars of any kind, even organic, locally grown honey and agave nectar, to stop all grains, including quinoa, spelt, and amaranth, but of course, rice, oats, wheat, and corn. And then to stop all vegetable oils of any kind, whether you cook with them or add them to your food, or whether they're added in the processed food that you get from the grocery or from a restaurant. And for most people, just those 3 steps will take them a great distance back towards the health status that they're looking for.
Yeah, I would agree, Ken. And as I've gone through the myriad different causes and root cause diagrams and all the things you can do, but if you eliminated refined carb, sugar, and veg oils and the processed foods that those things are stuffed into alone, yeah, some people may need to do more. They may have heavy metal contamination. They may have ApoE4 gene and are highly sensitive to certain things. But for the vast majority, if they just did all that and stuck to that, they'd be massively ahead of their compatriots who are heading for a heart attack.
Exactly. And as I said earlier, I'm taking care of the middle class, working man on the street. And so for that guy, those 3 huge dietary interventions, although he may not appreciate them, her may not appreciate these changes initially, because most of them have carbohydrate addiction, sugar addiction, and they've just grown up on these foods. So it really feels foreign not to have those foods as part of every meal. But once they get used to that and they start to see the laboratory and the imaging numbers go back towards normal, most of them are on board for life. They're like, well, and the common comment is, well, hell, I wish someone had told me this 20 years ago. And I agree and say, yeah, me too, but they didn't. And so all we can do is start from today and go towards tomorrow.
Yeah, very much so. And it is an absolute tragedy that people have been misinformed for so many decades, leading us to where we are today. But that's just the way it is. So we just got to counter it. What about exceptions to, low carb? I would see as a generally best average diet for the modern population, because when 2/3 are essentially diabetic, it's absurd to have a high carb diet in someone who's carbohydrate intolerant. And we know from Verta and from all the trials, Volek and Finney, we know that low carb, healthy fats diet has huge immediate benefits for people with diabetic physiology and can even put it into remission, call it reversal, whatever. Lose weight, feel great. But are there any exceptions to a low carb diet with high animal saturated fat and protein? And what I'm thinking of is something I'm looking into more lately, the ApoE4 genotype, where there appears to be some data that ApoE4 type genotype, and anyone can get the test from 23andMe, you can find out, they're around 17% of the population that are the oldest genome. And they appear to be very sensitive to modern foods and problematic things in the environment. So they get much higher Alzheimer's and more heart disease. There appears to be some data that those specific people, if they've eaten the wrong foods, like your foods, the vegetable oils, the sugars, refined carb, and they've become diabetic, they can, it appears, be a little sensitive to excessive saturated fat and protein. It can push up their insulin, small dense LDL. So we need more data, but what do you think for those people? There are alternative low carb diets, maybe, to play it safe if you're the most affected guy.
Yeah, and so there are a very few inborn errors of metabolism that won't do well on a ketogenic or a low carb, high healthy fat diet. And people are always wanting to know, well, who are the people who can't eat keto? And so I was going to make a YouTube video about it, but the more I looked into it, the percentage of people who are physiologically basically barred from eating keto are so small. And these people they've visited a geneticist when they were a child. They've been to the pediatric endocrinologist. They're on a special diet from day one, very early in their childhood. And these people know for sure they can't eat keto. They don't need a YouTube video from me, right, on my channel. And so I haven't even made the video because it wouldn't help very many people at all, because everyone who can't eat keto, they already know I have this or that inborn error of fatty acid metabolism. I can't eat that fat or I'll have trouble. And they already know who they are. And so I wouldn't help anyone by making that video. But I think that the ketogenic diet, as I define it, and I think the ketogenic diet is a spectrum diet. And I keep trying to think of a better way to describe it. But I think there are some people, depending on your genetics, who do very well on a very veg-heavy, not much fatty meat ketogenic diet. I think they do very well with that. Other people do great with a half and half. Some people do better with a fatty meat heavy ketogenic diet with just a little veg. And then I think there is a subset of the population that does best on a fatty meat only diet or a carnivore diet. And there are a few pretty visible people in the public forum talking about this now, and I think that the carnivorous diet is not for everyone. But I don't think it's going to hurt anyone to try it for a month or two. If you've tried multiple different diets and even different styles of a ketogenic diet, I don't think I don't think there's a shred of research out there, or even any common sense, that says trying this for a month or two is going to harm you in any permanent way. And so the ApoE gene, and there's different little SNP errors in the DNA that you think, well, maybe they should eat more of this or less of that. But I think for the vast majority of human beings on the planet Earth today, eating some form of a ketogenic or a low carb, high healthy fat diet is the proper human diet. And I think that the diabetes and prediabetes and insulin resistance epidemics that we're seeing are evidence that human beings were never meant to eat this many carbohydrates in a day. I think that's what that shows. If you just back up and look at this with the eyes of a common sense farmer or a common sense veterinarian, if you're feeding your cows a certain diet and they're all getting diabetes, that's probably the wrong diet. You probably shouldn't feed them that diet anymore. And the average farmer and the average vet would pick up on it like that. But it seems that it's very hard for the average doctor or dietitian to pick up on that for some reason. I don't know why it's so hard for them to switch their paradigm in that direction. But I think that's what the evidence is showing us, is that human beings were never, ever meant to eat this many carbohydrates in a day. And I think Len said, if you followed that, you'd be getting somewhere between 275 and 375 grams of carbohydrates every single day. And so all that's going to do is drive the diabetes epidemic to even higher numbers.
I would agree. That's kind of crazy advice. There's no question about that. And, you know, I saw recently they're developing a new glucose meter for cows, for cattle, because they're having a diabetes problem.
That's right. That's right.
It needs to be measured a little different than a human glucose meter. So they're developing meters. Rats in New York are getting diabetes. So cats, diabetes, I know a veterinarian friend, and he said cat diabetes is everywhere. And he tells them you got to give the cat meat and protein. But I guess my point broadly is, and Tucker made it the other day too, all of the animals, basically different species, if you feed them a human type diet of high carb and fat mixed and vegetable oil, certainly, they'll all get obese and diabetic. There are laboratory diets that are specifically sold to make animals fat and diabetic like humans, so you can test out human drugs. Those laboratory diets all have commonality. They have refined carbs, sucrose, sugar, they've got lard, and they've got plenty of omega-6 vegetable oil. So basically, the laboratory diet to make animals fat and diabetic to test human drugs is essentially the high veg oil and refined carb diet that everyone's eating.
Let's call that diet what it is. That is the latest fad diet that we've only been eating for the last 50, 60, 70 years. Never in the existence of human beings on this planet did we eat all these grains and ingest all the vegetable oils and eat all this sugar. We've never done this before in our history as a species. And so that's why I think if you were able to go back in time 10 or 20,000 years, you would find essentially no type 2 diabetes in any human being, because they would never they wouldn't be able to eat this diet. But even if they could, I think their common sense back then, they'd quickly realize, man, I feel like crap when I eat this. I'm going to stop eating this. And so, yeah, but I want people to understand the diet that we consider normal now is a fad diet that was basically fostered on the U.S. population back in the 50s and 60s based on some bogus research. And then the rest of the countries of the world kind of picked it up because the U.S. led the way, at least back then. I don't know if we still will after this fiasco is over. And so basically we just thought, hey, we're just going to try this because, a couple of scientists think this is the way humans should eat. There was never any randomized controlled trials done on this diet. This diet is completely untried and unproven scientifically, but for the last 60 years, it has been the diet. And so if someone's 20 or 30 or 40 years old, this seems like the diet that humans have always eaten because you've eaten it for your entire life. But the reality of the matter is that even 100 years ago, no human ate the amount of seed oils and processed grains and sugars that we eat today and consider it to be completely normal.
Yeah, and processed, like seed oils, processed carb, sugars, they are by definition the diet that is used to make any animal fat and diabetic. So it's absurd. There is a kind of a little one that came up a while back. I think it was Denise Minger mentioned that if you eat a kind of a fat and sugar and fat and refined carb diet 50-50, that's kind of a worst case nearly. If you go low carb, we see huge benefits. But if you go really high carb and really low fat, there's a kind of a precarious sweet spot there that people can be successful with. Now, I wouldn't go there. That's kind of like riding a razor's edge, and it's a starvy, non-nutritionally rich, non-appetizing diet. So why would you go to that unstable part of the equation? You'd go to low carb, healthy fats. But it is true that populations, especially if they've got a lot of other factors in their favor, environmental factors, they're eating unrefined carbs and they're eating very low fat, but nutrition in fish and some meat. They can get by. I don't think it's good for a person who was previously diabetic, whose machine is screwed, but for some populations, they can do it. What do you think about that option for people if they really want to do it?
Well, I think that diet is much preferable to starving to death. Right? That's exactly what I think about that diet. And I think the people who are forced to eat that diet would much prefer not to eat that diet, but they have no choice. It's either that or starvation. And so, yeah, if you calorie restrict someone that severely and all they have is unprocessed carbs, a little bit of fat and protein, yeah, they're going to be so emaciated and so cachectic that they're not going to be able to develop metabolic disease, but they're also going to be hungry and irritable and miserable and weak and not happy. And so most of my patients and most of the people that I consult with, they want to be happy and they want to be vigorous and they want to be strong and they want to be mentally clear and alert. And I think for the majority of people who I come into contact with, a low carb, high healthy fat diet gives them all those things with extra bonuses.
Well, that's my personal choice for sure. And the people we were talking about earlier anyway, who may have sustained metabolic damage and have sensitivities to excessive meat and fat and protein, there's a very simple answer. It's just more fish and avocado, and you still stay with a low carb, healthy fat. You watch your blood metrics, and you just have other options, but they're only slight tweaks. You certainly don't go to low fat, high carb. In my mind, that's crazy. What about the whole exercise thing? So there's varying views on that. A, how important is exercise for weight loss? And B, if you're going to do exercise, what's the ideal kind of regime for a busy person who knows they're not going to work out an hour or two a day? It just ain't going to happen.
Right. And so that's actually one of the chapters in Lies My Doctor Told Me, is that exercise is a great method of weight loss. And early in my medical career, I used to tell people, look, dude, this is simple. All you got to do is burn more than you eat. That's it. It's simple. It's calories in, calories out. And so I would say that every day to 20 or 30 people. And then over the next 3 years, I watched those 20 or 30 people get fatter and metabolically sicker. And so, and then I tell the story in the book, when I started to gain weight in my mid 30s, I implemented that on my own self. And so doctors always think their patients are being non-compliant. Like, oh, I know secretly you're laying in bed eating bacon all day. That's why you're not losing weight. But so when I started getting obese and pre-diabetic, and I was almost 297 pounds at one point, and my A1C was 5.9 or 6.1. It was getting on up there pre-diabetic. And so I implemented this thing. I'm going to burn more than I eat. I'm going to eat lots of low carb, whole grains. I'm going to stop all saturated fats. And then I just gained weight even faster. And so that was really my wake up call, is my personal health when I was about to become a diabetic, by following my own ignorant advice. And so I think multiple huge research studies have shown without doubt that exercise is a terrible strategy for weight loss. Okay. And so trying to burn more calories than you take in is an exercise in futility. It's basically a form of torture. No one can do that long term. It is completely unsustainable. And so people want to talk about keto. Oh, that's not sustainable. What's not sustainable is starving yourself for the rest of your life and working out like a slave for the rest of your life. That's not sustainable, because I don't think I've ever had a single patient do it for more than 3 months before they said, forget that, I'm not doing that. I'll just be fat, forget it. And so that's point number one, is that exercise is not the answer for weight loss. And so if you're obese or overweight, exercising, I'm not saying exercise is bad, but it is not the answer. That's not where you need to spend the bulk of your money and time and effort. That's not going to help you with the weight loss. Now, with that being said, now let's shift to just overall health and longevity. Exercise is great for those things, I believe. And so I think exercise is very, very good. And it's been shown in multiple studies to be preventative against dementia, against early bone fracture, against sarcopenia. I mean, all these things that basically lead to that inevitable whirlpool demise of the moth circling the flame. If you're not exercising, you're going to get there quicker, and that's not a place you want to be. And so, yeah, exercise is very important if you want to have a long health span and a long lifespan. But don't use it for weight loss. Use it for health. You're gonna fix your diet for the weight loss, and then you're going to use the exercise to keep your bone density strong, to keep your muscle mass up, to keep your brain healthy, to keep your mood happy. And so I'm like you, Ivor. I'm pretty darn busy, and I don't have time to go to the gym for an hour a day. And I'm never going to do that. And up until I was 50, I didn't work out at all. And people would accuse me, oh, you work out, what do you do? And I'm like, I see a lot of patients at the clinic, and then I go work on my farm. That's what I do. And for about 10 years from 40 to 50, that's exactly what I did. I never worked out. I used my diet to control my weight. But then I was also very active on my farm, but I didn't work out. But I started at 50 because I'd heard for the last time, oh, you can't put on any muscle if you're eating keto. There's just no way. There's not enough carbs to build muscle. And so I'm going to use my 50th year around the sun, or my 51st technically, to prove that wrong. And so I've started working out, and what I'm doing is a 3-day-a-week, very high intensity interval training where I lift very heavy weights for a few reps. I do that just with a few key exercises, and my workout is maybe 30 minutes long, maybe. And so I do that 3 days a week. And so far, I just walked through the living room here, and Nisha said, has that sweatshirt always been so tight on you? And I said, I don't think so. It used to be tighter down low, but now it's getting tight up top. And that's, I tell my patients, just a common sense metric. If this is the button that's about to pop and put out someone's eye, that's a good sign. But if it's that button down by your navel that's about to pop and put out an eye, that's a bad sign. And so I've kind of been shifting from being bigger in the middle to being bigger at the top, just with this very quick 3-day-a-week workout. And I think high intensity interval training for the vast majority of people who are busy, that's the way. I think that's what our ancestors did 50,000 years ago. I think the majority of their day they laid around and walked. They might walk several miles a day, but they would only run fast if something was about to eat them or if they were trying to eat something else. I think they would lift heavy stuff and climb trees if that were necessary, but otherwise they didn't work. They didn't never 50,000 years ago did one caveman say to the other caveman, "Hey, you want to go run 17 miles?" I don't think that ever happened back then, right? Because you would be kicked out of the tribe for being crazy.
Yeah, loony man. But no, you're getting beefed up there, and I thought it was just because you were a doctor, so you have to carry around all those bags of money that you get.
No, it's all those books that all the doctors read all the time. That's where the muscle comes from.
Well, I agree. The high intensity training, weight based training, body weight exercises, fantastic for building muscle. What I did recently, actually, last year, I was very busy, quite stressful, a lot going on. I put on a few pounds. I mean, it's a reality, you know. You indulge in really good food, even if you're not eating total crap. We will naturally put on a bit of weight if we're eating quite a bit of good food, even. It's not just carb. But this year I've decided, right, I'm going to trim down a bit. I felt like it. And I'm doing just 3 mile runs a couple of times a week. Bit of aerobic, feels great, sleep better. And I'm going to pick up as well on the weights. Just heavy barbells, upper body. And I'll probably just do that for a while. And the commitment per week is maybe a total of 90 minutes. It's very little. And the other thing is as well, if you really want to trim down in pretty speedily and healthily, you can just go really low carb keto. And even if you're more comfortable with ordinary low carb, go low carb keto for 4 or 6 weeks, lose a bunch of pounds, and also do more intermittent fasting. Put it together with a bit of weight bearing training, and you won't know yourself. And even my wife's happy for once.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that blending intermittent fasting or time restricted eating with keto, that's the ultimate tool for just getting back closer to your ideal health parameters. I've recommended a lot of diets over my practice, and I've never, ever seen anything as powerful as when somebody fasts for 16 or 18 hours a day and then eats keto in the remaining 6 or 8 hours of that day. And then and so every time I work out, I hear a lot of experts in the field say you have to carb load before you work out, or you will not be able to build any muscle. And so I'm making it a point for this year that I'm going to be fasting every time I work out. And so I always eat after I work out, so that I'm working out with at least an 18, if not a 22-hour fast. That's when I work out. And so I seem to be putting on a little muscle. We'll see how it goes over this year. I'm gonna post pictures, update pictures once a month for the next 12 months on my Facebook page. And so everybody can just go and there's the pictures. And so if I'm getting fat and floppy, people will be able to see that. I'm not going to hide any of this. And I also post every 6 months, I get a huge panel of blood work, and I post that on my Facebook page every 6 months as well, so that people can see in black and white, oh, look, Dr. Berry's total cholesterol is 350, and he doesn't care about that. But it's because his triglycerides are beautiful, his HDL is beautiful, his A1C is beautiful, and his C-peptide is beautiful. So he feels like he's metabolically protected from that heart attack and that stroke that my doctor's trying to scare me about, because my total cholesterol is 201.
Yeah, and you know, to the total cholesterol, there are people with high cholesterol that it indicates a challenge, and there are people with high cholesterol where there may be no challenge. But an interesting thing is, just now that you reminded me, if you go into the world's top 5 risk algorithms on the web, like AstroCharm or MESA, or you know, the pooled cohort equation or Framingham, you can put
What's not there?
Hmm?
What information do they not ask for?
They don't ask for LDL, but
That's right.
you can put in a 300 total and an 80 HDL or 75, and by definition, that person has a huge LDL, even though they don't. You put that in the calculator, and you put in 120 over 75 blood pressure, and you put in the other family history, diabetes, and you come out as low risk as a 55-year-old man. Low risk. But you know, the data you put in total and HDL by definition meant you must have an LDL of around 190. So even the world's risk calculators show that you don't necessarily have a problem with a high cholesterol once your ratios are good and your blood pressure's good and everything else. That's really important information. Yeah.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
another key thing that I want people to understand is that regardless of your age, you are still an athlete. And what I mean by that is for the people listening, if you're 40 or 50 or 60 or 70 or 80 or 90, you can still build muscle. You can still make your bone density stronger in a meaningful way. And taking most of the medications for osteoporosis, they do make your bone density higher, but it's not a meaningful bone density. It's a very disordered architecture of the bone matrix, and those people are still at high risk for a fracture. The way you make your bone density higher in a meaningful way is resistance exercise. And if you're 90 years old and you're listening to this and you can't even get up out of a chair right now without using both legs and both hands, you are still an athlete, and you can still make your bone density higher, and you can still put on muscle. And I counsel people on this every day. You don't have to be 20 years old and jacked up. You can start out lifting a can of corn in each hand, because you definitely wouldn't eat that, so you might as well use it as weights, right? But you can start from there, and before you know it, you've doubled the amount of muscle that you have in your core and on your thighs and in your butt. Because one of the biggest markers of all-cause mortality that makes your risk go sky high is sarcopenia, or basically a loss of a lot of muscle. When you get to a certain point where you don't have enough muscle, one big injury, a car wreck, you fall and break a hip, any of these things happen, if you don't have that muscle mass and that bone density, you're toast. You're done. And so many times in my medical career, I'd have an older patient who I love to death, who would fall and break a hip. And that's the literal beginning of the end. Within 6 months or a year, they're gone. And so that people have to understand, you're not done. If you're 50, 60, 70, 80, you're not over. You're not finished. You're not a has-been. You can absolutely get up out of that chair and start increasing your bone density, start increasing your cardiac output, start increasing your muscle mass. You can start doing that today. And you still have all the machinery, you have all the biochemistry, you have all the physiology for that to happen. Just eat the right diet and be more active, and you'll start putting on muscle regardless of your age or your medical condition.
Yeah, and absolutely. That's a great point, Ken. And you know, the other thing is, relative to how you were, if you do start eating right and you do the exercise and the weight bearing exercise without injuring yourself, obviously someone who's very soft starts slowly. But if you combine together synergistically multiple different things that we've talked about, even if you're 80, you're going to feel the benefits to your well-being, your mental health, everything. I remember I used to do triathlons, and in one of them down the far south of Ireland, on the tip of Ireland, Valentia Island, they had a t-shirt and it said, "Don't stop. You only fail if you stop."
That's it.
And
That's it.
that's it. If people get older and they feel there's nothing can be done, that's accepting your fate, and then you're just going to decline. But you can get off your ass.
I totally agree. And I was actually having a little slap fight with somebody on Twitter the other day who said, why would you even recommend a ketogenic diet to somebody in their 80s or 90s? What good is it going to do? And so my reply was, well, if that was your grandfather and you were like, and you didn't want to miss him because he was either in the nursing home or dead, and if your grandfather actually wanted to play with his grandchildren and great grandchildren, that's why it's important. And so, you know, a lot of people who are in their 20s, 30s, and 40s think that if you're in your 60s, 70s, or 80s, you're done. There's no hope for you. There's no point. Just eat the milkshakes and the lemon meringue pie. Who cares anyway? But I can tell you at 50, I very much care. And at 60, I'm still going to care. And at 70 and 80 and 90, and when I'm 110, and you and I are creeping around on the 85th annual low carb cruise together, I'm going to care. I'm going to care what I look like. I'm going to care what I feel like. I'm going to care about kicking a soccer ball with my great-great-grandchildren. Yeah, I have plans to do all that. And in order to do that, I've got to optimize all these things that we've talked about tonight. And I've got to minimize all of the slow poisons that are the standard American diet. also the slow poisons that are the Canadian dietary guidelines, also the slow poisons that is eat Lancet.
Yeah, and you know, you're absolutely right. You only get one shot at this. You want to have a machine that's kept in great condition for as long as possible and get as much use out of it. No question about it. Too many people give up. And in their defense, I suppose, with all the bad advice they've been given, you can understand why they give up. Because the pills don't work, they probably just make things worse. And the dietary advice is only going to put them into the ground sooner. But hopefully more and more people will hear proper advice like this, and we can pull our way out of this population health disaster.
Well, hopefully with social media, people
Yeah.
like you and I and our many friends in this space are able to reach thousands upon thousands of people who can then, when they've turned their health around, share it with their friends and neighbors as well. And that's a huge part of this. What we're talking about right here, Ivor, is there's never going to be a press conference that all the networks interrupt our normal standard broadcasting to bring you this special news report. The CDC and the American Diabetes Association have a joint announcement that you should eat keto. That's never going to happen, right? And so if people are to have any hope of some meaningful health span where they feel great, look great, and act great, we're going to have to share this with our friends and our neighbors and the guy down the street and the guy we work with, because otherwise they'll never hear this message.
Yeah, for sure. And that's for that we toil. I don't know if I mangled that quote, but something like that. And you know, you just made me think I'm going to give a shout out to Con Quinn, who's my friend's father. And he is that person. He's 92, I think, now. And he worked full time as a builder until he was 83. And he still drives to his farm, does market gardening, does jobs around the house at 93. He'll still go out for a few pints.
I love it. I love it. One of my patients, let me tell you this quick little story. He's been eating keto for several years, and he came in about a month or two ago, and he was a follow-up from the emergency department. He had wrecked his all-terrain vehicle, which is, we call them four-wheeler here, and he had broken 4 of his ribs and had a flail chest, and he had to spend a few days in the hospital. And so he was coming to me for hospital follow-up. And I was like, dude, what in the hell were you doing? Why, I mean, how did you wreck your ATV? And he said, well, I was showing off for my girlfriend, and I was going to jump this pile of rocks. And this guy, he's 87 years old. And so he was showing off for his girlfriend and wrecked his four-wheeler and broke his ribs. And so that's the kind of life that we can expect to have if we take care of this one machine we're given. You can be that guy that's still showing off for his sweetheart when he's in his late 80s. And you can be the guy like Ivor's friend who's working on his farm when he's in his 90s. That can absolutely happen if you remove the slow poisons and put back in real food.
Yeah, and you know, I will have to say as well, that guy I mentioned, he never swallowed any of the bullshit, never ate margarines. He always ate chicken, meat, fish, some vegetables. He never listened to any of that stuff we were told. And that actually is one of the reasons a lot of people are still okay. The people who ignored it and believed their grandmother, which is ironic. All this science in the 20th century, and you are better off if you actually ignored their so-called findings. But yeah.
That's
So
because it was a fad diet. That's why. It was a fad that started in the 50s based on no real meaningful scientific research. It's been a fad, and some people even think it has been a trial, a scientific trial, just to see what would happen if you fed humans this disastrous diet. And now we have our findings, so let's go back to eating the old way.
yeah, exactly. They had their experiment, and well, how did that work out? Yeah. Here, you know, there's another topic springs to mind now, something I didn't get into too much in my research, but I noticed on your YouTube you had several videos lately on it. The whole problem with Hashimoto's and thyroid, and it comes up a lot, and your cholesterol values and ratios can be thrown out of whack with thyroid problems. So maybe just give a bit of a summary of America's thyroid problem.
Yeah, and so first of all, you make an excellent point that, and I'll just tell you how a doctor can be very smart but yet not know a damn thing about anything. About 2 years into my practice, I was going to get a cholesterol machine that would check a complete lipid panel in my office, and so I was looking up all the codes that would pay for a lipid panel because I didn't want to be ordering if I wasn't going to get reimbursed. And one of them was hypothyroidism. And I can remember very vividly thinking back in 2003, why would that pay for a lipid panel? And I literally was a board certified, thoroughly trained U.S. physician and had no idea how hypothyroidism could affect lipid panel levels. And so I looked that up, thankfully, and I was like, oh, okay, I didn't realize that. And so, yeah, your thyroid can have very major effects on your lipid panel values. And there is a veritable epidemic, at least in the U.S., of Hashimoto's thyroiditis and hypothyroidism. And I think it's caused fully by the disastrous slow poison diet that we're fed our entire life. It may have something to do with the plastics and the microplastics in the environment that we're exposed to. No one really knows what makes the human immune system attack part of the thyroid system. No one really knows why, but we just know it didn't used to happen. And now it's happening on a more and more frequent basis. So it has to be something in our environment, most likely something we're ingesting. But yeah, if your thyroid is not optimized, your cholesterol numbers are definitely going to be wacky. And I've got several videos about both cholesterol and thyroid because they're such important topics for people to understand because the average doctor doesn't understand them.
So thyroid is something I'd certainly, your few videos there summarize it great. And it's something people should really be watching. But then the autoimmune diseases, I mean, the kind of all these kind of Crohn's disease and bowel problems and autoimmunity is a huge thing in this century. And I think we are seeing with low carb and keto diets and intermittent fasting and removal of grains and removal of vegetable oils, we can alleviate a lot of these conditions to a greater or lesser extent. Now, it doesn't prove causality, but mitigation and alleviation can go a long way to making people's lives far, far better.
Absolutely. And I've had hundreds of patients at the Berry Clinic whose autoimmune disease that used to ravage their body and ravage their life, where I've had people with psoriasis that was so severe they wouldn't even go to the store because they felt like the elephant man. They looked, their psoriasis had taken over all of their skin. And they were on a biological injectable, methotrexate, daily steroids, and still the psoriasis was winning. And then when they removed step 1, 2, and 3, like we talked about, and started eating real food again, the eczema or the psoriasis very often goes back to the little sentinel patch down on their leg or on their butt or on their back somewhere. And it's very manageable. It's not a big deal at all. They'll always have that predisposition for it to flare up if they go off reservation. But as long as they keep the poison out of their diet and keep the real food in their diet, autoimmune diseases just seem to kind of go into remission. It's as if the immune system becomes intelligent again, because many doctors will describe an autoimmune disease as, oh, your immune system is overactive or too strong, and so we're going to have to give it these medicines to beat it down. That's a completely inaccurate and inappropriate paradigm to explain this to patients. What we should really be saying is your immune system is currently stupid. It's attacking a part of you that it should absolutely know not to attack. But your immune system, you want a strong immune system. You don't want to beat it down so that you're at risk of every little infection that passes by. But you want your immune system to also be intelligent and to be able to recognize you versus non-you. And it seems like the ketogenic way of eating, whether it's mostly veg or mostly fatty meat, calms down the immune system, and it can kind of take a breath, symbolically speaking, and go, okay, wait a minute, why am I attacking this thyroid? That looks like that's part of me. Maybe I should leave that alone.
Yeah, that's a good analogy to describe it. Or basically, your immune system is like a hive of bees, and people for the last 50 years have been poking sticks at it without even knowing all the time. So we can't really blame it either. It worked great for millennia until we came along with our modern stuff. So we probably curl in now and go towards wrapping it up. One thing else that occurs to me is Professor Richard Feynman said to me in New York a couple of years ago in an interview. He told this little anecdote, and he said one of the problems with low carb is it alleviates or fixes so many modern ailments that if you went through them all and claimed them, even in certain circumstances, people would say you're a liar because it can't be that good. And he said the irony is that when they developed a certain famous dandruff shampoo, his brother was senior in a big corporation where they developed this famous anti-dandruff shampoo, and they discovered within 2 days you would see very noticeable results on your shoulders. But the marketing department said, no, 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 you can't claim 2 days. And we'll say 5 days. And even though it was true, they said, if you claim that, people won't believe you. And he said, that's like the low carb diet. Not for everyone, but for irritable bowel, for GERD, for autoimmune and many other issues, for obesity. There's so many modern conditions that will respond in general extremely well to a low carb diet that if you start claiming them all, they call you a quack.
Yeah, it sounds like you're peddling snake oil. It sounds like it's a panacea. And but when you actually recognize it for what it is, which is the proper human diet, it kind of is a panacea. Because if I were poisoning 1,000 people in your neighborhood with mercury, right, and they were all getting sick and their teeth were falling out and they just were in the hospital all the time, and then if I stopped the mercury poisoning, every single one of them would get magically better. And so then I would say, well, look, I cured all these people by stopping their mercury exposure. That's not a panacea. That's just removing the poison. And I think that's what basically, there's nothing magic about keto. It's just the proper ancestral human diet. What we're doing is removing the slow poisons that are the standard American diet in the Canadian dietary guidelines and Eat Land Set. When you remove all those slow poisons, the human body heals and goes back to its normal condition, which is healthy, vigorous, vibrant, mentally clear, mentally alert, mentally sharp, and not sick all the damn time. That's our normal state, is to be healthy and vigorous. Our normal state is not to have 3 to 5 prescription medications and not be able to get out of the chair without using both feet and both hands.
So in summary then, really quickly wrapping it up, blood measurements, C-peptide, insulin, post-meal glucose, maybe a glucometer, and cholesterol ratios, triglyceride and HDL and all. These are good blood measures. And then anyone middle-aged who's middle risk, if you're high risk in your bloods, in fairness, you've already got a problem and atherosclerosis probably on the way. But if you're middle risk, calcification scan, 5 minutes, very low radiation, $150, and you find out where you are and you get a baseline measurement to go take action if it's high, and you can check back in a few years the action's worked. Thyroid, something big to watch for, I think. Any other things people should watch for outside of the core that we've discussed?
Basically, all of it comes from the diet. And so keeping a close eye for signs of metabolic disease, keeping a close eye on the skin, keeping a close eye on your activity level, your sleep, your mood. If any of those are off, then you need to have a good full laboratory panel of blood work checked, because that's not natural for human beings to be depressed or to be tired all the time or to not be able to sleep. That's not natural. If you had a dog who couldn't sleep good or who was, morbidly obese that's not normal for dogs. You never see a fat coyote or a fat fox in the wild. It just doesn't happen. Human beings are still living in the wild. This is our wild, right? If you're poisoning us and giving us too many carbohydrates, we're going to get fat and sick. If you remove that slow poison, we're going to get better. And some of us will get better than others, but we're all going to get better to at least some degree. And so one other thing I would say is if anybody is pre-diabetic or diabetic, you absolutely need a CGM or a continuous glucose monitor. There's no tool that you're going to have that can quickly ferret out bad dietary advice than a CGM. Because when you go to the dietitian and they say, oh, you should have oatmeal for breakfast and a glass of orange juice, right, and a bowl of fruit, and then you can watch on your smartphone as your blood sugar goes sky high, you'll know that dietitian doesn't know what they're talking about when it comes to the care and feeding of human beings. So if you have any kind of pre-diabetes or diabetes, you need a continuous glucose monitor. You'll never be given false dietary advice that you follow more than once ever again, because you can have immediate feedback to see what your body does with that meal that you were told was healthy for human beings to eat.
Yeah, and that old CGM, continuous glucose monitor, that can let you personally catch all those liars, right?
That's exactly right. That's a great lie detector when it comes to human diet.
Yeah, excellent. We're going to see a lot more of those, and maybe insulin measures or handheld insulin maybe the next decade will be another fantastic thing. So I'm going to wrap it up there. We both got to get back to work, and yeah, it's been great talking to one of the few doctors who always tells the truth. You know, that's been a
As
pleasure.
I currently know it. Now, tomorrow I may change my story, but that's the truth as I know it at this moment in time.
Well, I haven't caught you out with a lie yet, so be mindful. I'm watching. I'm watching.
Always.
Thanks a lot, Ken. Great stuff.
My pleasure. See you next time.